I thought I should probably introduce myself a little bit as well, because as when I was talking to Claire, we were talking all about the projects that we've been doing and what's happening with climate change and so on. And she said to me, so are you a botanist or an environmental scientist or something? And I said, no. I'm actually a business consultant by trade. So I bring the how do we deal with the people and data and make stuff happen skills to our projects in the Yass area network of Landcare. But I've worked with lots of the analysis we've done about the climate and the plants and so on. So I've got a reasonable level of practitioner experience with this stuff, but I'm by no means a scientist or an expert. But I think in some respects that's helpful because it's those of us who aren't who really need to engage with this a lot more from here on. So that's a little bit about me. And then to answer the question about the plants and the nurseries here, so these came from the Bowning nursery, which is a few k's down the road from where I live actually. So the Yass area network of Landcare groups has a handful of nurseries. So each group runs them slightly different in different locations. So the Bowning-Bookham group has 2, the Yass group has 2, and the Mara Bateman group has 1. So these ones came from the Bowning nursery. But one of the things that has been great about the Climate Ready Vegetation project, which I'll talk about, which is all the nurseries contributed to this project, and so they've now standardised their procedures and they've learned all about provenancing and a whole range of other things, which has been a kind of side effect of us doing this project together. And the other thing I should point out is that it looks like here, with these 2 particular trays, that the non-local ones are bigger than the local ones. It's actually not the case en masse when you look at them in the nursery. It's been really interesting to see. There was a whole table full of these, the local ones were bigger than the ones that had come from elsewhere, and it was the same with the ukes in the Yass nursery. I'm less sure about how the wattles grew. The other interesting thing that happened in terms of the plants was the ukes that we grew, the Meliodoras. The local ones have a straight up and down habit, and the ones from further west have a multi-trunk branching out sideways sort of habit, and you can see it in the nursery. You don't have to know where the seed came from when you just look at how the trees grow. So there's an interesting factoid, something we didn't expect to learn, but it's what we're learning as we go along. So that's a little bit about me and some of the things we've been doing and the plants here, and happy to talk about any of this more either today after the session here, or very happy to come and visit other groups or Zoom or whatever, because this is going to be very much a once over lightly. I usually cover this in about 2-3/4 of an hour presentations, and I've condensed it down into about half an hour. So that means some of the slides are a bit busy as well, but we're going to try and stick to the time because I know you've all got lots of other commitments to go to as well, she says, looking at her watch. So let's see where we start here, and maybe a bit of a show of hands. Who's had a look at some of the local climate information? There's lots around about what's happening globally, and we've got 1.5 degrees of this and 2.5 of something else and 5 of something else, but there's actually information we can access mostly from the New South Wales government. There's lots of information around on what's happening globally, but there's actually quite a bit locally, but a lot of people don't know that it's there, but I'm pleased to see that a bunch of people here have actually seen it. But this is the kind of quick and dirty version of what's actually happening to our climate. So we've got Yass marked on the map here, but this essentially applies to the whole Canberra region because we're similar enough in the biosphere here. So what's happening is we're getting hotter, most likely, and the rainfall patterns from the projections are less clear. So it may get hotter and drier, or it may get hotter and wetter. But what we also know is that our rainfall is going to get a lot less reliable in the future. So the reason this says that we're moving is because it's like we're moving to places that are much further west than us. So we might be moving to Mildura or Dubbo or Gilgandra. We could be going down into Shepparton or way up into, actually up into Queensland here. But essentially what that means is we're moving from a cool temperate climate with our lovely 4 seasons and our rainfall patterns where we get more autumn and winter and spring rain to actually having the rain more in summer and autumn, which from the BOM session yesterday we know is actually already happening as well. So that means we're essentially moving towards more of the projections show hotter and drier, but not all of them. So it's moving towards semi-arid or moving towards warm temperate. and we need to hedge our bets between both of those things, is really what we've learned from looking at the projections and the climate science and also the plants at the moment. And I think that's still a bit hard to wrap our heads around. What does that really look and feel like? And I've got some other things I could talk about another time where I can show you literally what the vegetation in these different places looks like, which gives you a better feel for it. But what does this actually mean for what's going to happen in our environment and in this context in our catchment? Well, we did some early analysis in the Climate Ready Vegetation project where we had a quick look. We just did a comparison of the plant lists of what grows in our Yass Valley council area versus what grows in a number of these other council areas that are in the projected future area. And about half of the plants that grow in our area grow in these other places and the other half don't. So that gives us at least a rough idea that we've got a reasonable level of risk that our environment is probably not going to function the same. Yes, there's some other differences in terms of soils and other conditions between these areas that will have shaped that as well. But given a 50-50 result, that seems to suggest we need to actually do something about this. We can't just leave our environment as it is and hope that maybe our vegetation will make it through, because it may not, or some of it may and some of it may not, as we'll get to in a little while. So that gives you a quick snapshot of what's happening locally. And often when I talk about this, I kind of feel the audience go, when I start to talk about this, but don't worry, we'll get to what we do about it, so then you can breathe out again. So what are the challenges and how do we respond to this, just very quickly? So I think there's three main things that come out of what's happening in our local area with climate. So we're probably looking at loss of species and biodiversity as a result of these sorts of changes, which gives us a conservation challenge because, so for example, Linda Broadhurst at CSIRO has done some work looking at, I think it's the red box, it's one of the eucalypts, and its distribution is basically up and down the east coast of Australia at the moment. And the projections work that she's done shows it basically goes down to Bega and that little area there. So we know we have a reasonable level of confidence that quite a lot of our species are probably not going to be suited to what our future climate is. And I can talk about that a bit more in a little while. That gives us kind of two sides of that coin. Part of it is that we need to conserve those. So if that red box is going to shrink down to that small area, then how do we actually keep the genetics and make sure that that is a viable population and that we keep that natural history and all of the value that we get from that for life on the planet and for ourselves as humanity as well. So there's a conservation piece that comes out of that. And there's also an adaptation piece that comes out of that because as far as we can tell, we need to look at this and see that, well, if maybe up to half of the species that live in our area won't be suited to it in the future, then what's going to grow here and how are we going to replace it? Do we really want to sit here and wait and see what happens? Or do we make some educated, very well educated assessments and start bringing in genetics of the same species from elsewhere or other species from elsewhere, but we need to do that in a really well considered and scientifically driven way. So that's part of the adaptation from a vegetation and environmental perspective. But we also need to think about this in terms of our daily lives. If you think about what a place like Gilgandra is like, so I was there in May this year and I walked up and down the road and it was 20 degrees outside. That's what my car temperature sensor told me. But it felt like it was 27 or 28, like what it would be here. And it took me actually going there to physically understand what this stuff really means. I needed to go and see it for myself. But in terms of what our daily lives are like, that means we need to adapt our homes and our community spaces. It means we need more tree cover in our public spaces. It means when we think about sport, we'll have twice as many extreme heat days as we have at the moment. So how do you run a cricket season in the middle of summer when you've got X days above 40 degrees? There's really practical things that this does to our lives. So the time is now to do something about this because we have an opportunity still to make a difference to it. But that opportunity will expire. So again, adaptation is another part of the response to the challenges that we have here. So the third issue that we have coming out of these local climate changes is that really a lot of this is driven by how we as humans live and what our impact on the planet is. And we can do all of the environmental and biodiversity work we like, but there's not enough area on the Earth to offset the amount of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that we make as a species. So no matter how much environmental work we do, we've still got to do the work to reduce our ecological footprints. And in Australia, in the last couple of years, we've been using about 5 times the amount of resources our Earth could renew per person. So we need to, in Australia, we need to start thinking Pareto, 80-20 rule. How do we reduce our footprint by about 80%? So this minimise piece is as critical as the conservation and the adaptation. And so there's ways we can think about this in our natural resource management projects too. One of the things that bugs me is steel fencing. I don't know how much emissions comes from exactly producing a piece of steel, but I suspect we need to do a lot more offsetting for the amount of steel that we're putting into our landscape in some respects as well. So things like that, and even just how far we drive to do our projects, and do we need to actually go and physically meet people for meetings and stuff like that. All of those things we're going to have to do in order to meet that 80-20 change that we need to make. So hopefully that's a quick overview of what's happening locally and the sorts of things that are the issues and challenges and what we can do about it. So the reason Claire originally got in touch with me was to talk about the Climate Ready Vegetation project. So this project is, I suppose, the first response that the Yass area network Landcare groups have come up with, which fits into that adaptation box that we were just talking about now. So the purpose of this project is essentially to look at what can we do to enhance the long-term survival of vegetation in our area, which sounds like a pretty big thing, but it pretty much just comes down to, does stuff grow and is it going to survive in the long term? And where this came from was really, so I've been part of the Habitat Hops project in Bowning-Bookham Landcare for the last few years. So we've put 10,000 trees into the ground over 3 years. Murray Bateman Landcare has produced about 10,000 in their nursery every year for the last 10 years. So they've done like 100,000. And we were thinking about this and looking at climate change and thinking, gee, I hope all this work we're doing is going to be worth it, because if those trees die, frankly, I'm going to be really pissed because it's a lot of work. So let's see, is this actually worthwhile, or is there something we need to do to adapt what we're doing here? So luckily, we came across the Climate Ready Vegetation Guide, which I'd recommend to everybody if you haven't seen it already, which is some work done by Nola Hancock, Linda Broadhurst and friends here, and it's a really good start on wrapping your head around what are the issues and what are the strategies, which is what the little picture here is about, which I'll talk about in a minute. So they've been through the scientific literature and also looked at what are all the tools that are available that from essentially the climate projections and the species information that we have from government, and looked at what's a process we can use to actually identify what's going to be more likely to be tolerant in our local climate in the future. So we've worked with Nola Hancock at Macquarie University and also with the Adapt New South Wales team who look after the projections that we have for New South Wales, which has been an awesome project that they don't get enough credit for, I have to say. So we've worked with them through a process to look at a whole range of different species and essentially understand how tolerant of our future climate might that be. And in doing that, what we've selected for our area is this thing called an admixture strategy, which is why this bit is circled here. So when you look at adapting to changing climate, there's a number of different strategies that have been identified in the scientific literature. So a lot of people immediately think of the climate adjusted one, which is the top of the graph there. So essentially you look at what your future projections might be and the areas that are similar, and you just sample seed effectively, provenances, from the areas that are in the direction your climate is likely to be tending in the future. And the further away it gets from where the projections are, the less seed you use of it. The challenge we have in our area is because we've got that uncertainty around the rainfall in our area, we can't be 100% sure whether it's going to be hotter and drier or hotter and wetter, or some weird combination from the two is probably plausible given what's happened in the last few years as well. We've gone for an admixture strategy, and this is what we kept finding when we went through the individual species. We kept coming back to an admixture strategy when we looked at them individually. So we decided, look, we've done enough. 80-20 rule, we'll go with that for most of them and then we'll deal with the rest by exceptions. So what the admixture strategy does is, if you look at the map in the top section here, essentially we're saying that, so this is an example for the Eucalyptus melliodora. So the distribution of it, this is in the niche finder system from the New South Wales government. So these are all instances of Eucalyptus melliodora that have been validated by a botanist. So it's definitely that someone has identified it, unlike ALA where you can get a bit more variation in your data. So anyway, for the Eucalyptus melliodora, you can see how long the distribution of it is here in Australia. So with the admixture strategy, we're essentially trying to get some seed from all of these different areas and tip it all into the bucket, which is what we've done with the admixture ones we've got here. And then we're planting all of those together and we're just letting nature take over and do the rest, essentially. We've put as many genetics of the species in as we possibly can, and there's some reality check that goes with that I'll talk about later. And then we've put them all in the same place. We're going to grow them all together. And where the trial comes in is that we've actually done that in a scientific way. So we've got two main sites where we've got about 500 tube stock planted in each of those. And we've got 7 supporting sites that have roughly 100, 150 each in them as well. So we're tracking over time, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, looking at the survival rate of the local versus the non-local species, just like these, so that we can see, does this actually work? Because you can make an argument for, well, the ones that grow in other places shouldn't grow here because they don't grow here, otherwise they would. Well, the only way we can test a whole bunch of questions from that arise when you try and understand how you might manage this adaptation process is by actually doing it. So we'll be able to see from the local compared to the non-local species which ones are growing better and surviving at least in this initial period. But as Jill, who's part of the project team, likes to say, this is a forever project. So we're looking at 3 to 5 years, but we won't really know for like 500 years what really happened. But if we do nothing, then we'll have even less information and that'll make decision making even harder. So in terms of the process that we've worked through for the different species, we look at the distribution of the plant, and then what this chart about is our friends at the Adapt New South Wales team help us to combine the distribution data. So each of these black dots on this chart here is those dots that are up on the map. So we combine that distribution with our climate data. So the range that we'll be in is between these orange dots here. And then we've got an assessment process we work through to look at, well, what's the distribution in here? Is there enough of this species growing between this range? And we do this through several different lenses, which is what the table at the bottom is about. So this is looking at annual average temperature and precipitation. But we know from growing plants in our area that it's often the hottest, driest and the coldest and wettest periods of the year, or the seasons that actually kill the plants, and it's the survival that we're interested in. So we also have a look at the different quarters with those hottest, driest and coldest, wettest conditions as well. And if you have a look on the website with the list in there now, where we've been through all the species, it is interesting to see. It is worth looking at those different conditions because some of them make it through the annual test and then they don't make it through the hot and dry or the cold and wet. But what we have found is some of the species, the plants from some of these different areas, they tend to survive more in the hotter and drier or the colder and wetter. So we're getting a better sense that we may be having to mix different species and provenances to get a mix of vegetation in the environment that's actually going to endure. Now that's a very quick once over. We now can get through this process in about half an hour per species. We're constantly looking for ways to do it faster and faster and in more and more bulk, because that's still quite slow. But when we first started, it was taking us hours. So as I was saying to Tom earlier, if you're thinking about doing this sort of stuff, do please come and talk to us in more detail about how you do it all and learn all the lessons from us, because it's taken us 3 years. We started in 2018. So it's taken us 3 years to get from we want to understand this long-term survival problem to actually having trees in the ground for a trial. And a lot of that has been the learning around this process and the nurseries and getting the nursery system working correctly, because you've got to be quite disciplined in how you manage your nursery if you want to do this trial level sort of work. Or you can choose not to and just take the lessons we've learned and run with that. That's perfectly fine as well. So that gives you an idea of what we've worked through with the Climate Ready Vegetation project and where that's heading. So the other interesting thing that we've learned is around the reality of doing this versus the theory. So the theory, which is going through all of the species charts and the distributions and the climate projections and smashing it all together and coming up with our assessment so we know what's more or less likely to tolerate our future climate. So we started with a list of 27 species, which we narrowed down to 7 to work with to try and get it to a manageable number to start off with. And then we went back to Greening Australia and said, great, we want to do these 7 species and we want 4 to 6 different seed provenances, so from seed source from different areas around New South Wales. Can you please go and do that for us? And we need a local one as well. And they came back and said, well, no, we can only do that for 3. And you can't necessarily have 4 or 6. You can have 3 or 4. And for, I think, the Meliodora, particularly getting local seed was one of the difficulties. So it's not just a challenge in how we connect into the wider seed production and nursery type network. It's also locally, we need to be thinking about how do we manage seed. So I'm really pleased to see the work that Greening Australia is leading around the national seed strategy and the investments that we need to make here, because unless we actually get seed so we can get it into the ground and grow things, we have no option for our adaptation and our conservation to a large extent. So I think this is something that as natural resource managers, we actually all need to start considering and working on, because if you go and read the strategy, it explains why, but essentially there's not enough seed collectors, so there's not enough seed, and seed collecting is a really labour intensive activity to do. So the seed collectors need to be paid better for the work that they do as well in order for this to succeed. And in my opinion, I think we probably have to do some of it with volunteer effort as well, because just some plants, like some of the annual forbs and things, they're so finicky. You've got to catch them at exactly the right time. You really need the person who's walking past them every day to just go, right, today's the day, and catch them. Sending someone out on a special trip from somewhere an hour or 2 or 3 away is probably just not going to be a viable proposition. So, and I think this is one of the other things where us working in a catchment and a regional basis really makes a lot of sense, because it is labour intensive, but if we all do a bit, then I think we can actually do that really effectively. But it's a big, big risk for us in moving ahead in this climate response work and even just our general conservation type work as well. So this was a really interesting reality check. We got so excited when we got to the end of our list and we'd done all our analysis. We're like, cool, we'll just go and get the seed and it'll all be awesome. Well, it's a bit harder than that. So, but that's okay. That's exactly why we wanted to do this, is to learn what works and what doesn't, and we'll see how it all grows. So speaking of which, here is people happily planting tube stock in our trial sites. As I mentioned, there's now about 1,800 tube stock that have gone in, and we'll start doing the monitoring each year of the survival rate, which I think we might do around Melbourne Cup Day, because spring is a good time to do it, and we all felt like we needed a celebration by the time we got this far, and we can have a bit of a celebration every year, which is kind of where my interest in people and how we do this as human beings comes in as well, because we need to make sure we celebrate these things and keep it positive and engaging as well. And so if doing our monitoring on Melbourne Cup Day with a glass of champagne in one hand, maybe afterwards, is what we need to do these sorts of things, then bring it on. So what happens next? So we've got our trial plants in. We're going to keep doing the monitoring, but what we're trying to do in the Yass area is really make the admix provenance strategy for everything we grow consistent across what all the groups do and what all our nursery practices are, which is now easier with the essentially the upgrade in the nursery practices that's happened in the last year or two. But we're also starting to look at how do we respond to what's happening with climate in our other projects and across the region as well. So the Bowning-Bookham group is leading on behalf of the whole area this Let's Try It project as well, which is a different climate adaptation sort of project. So it's more working with the locals on applying adaptation techniques around grazing, around soils management, and around planting climate-wise vegetation. So I just wanted to let you know that that's out there as well. So we can infuse this into everything we do. It doesn't need to be an extra add-on, but there are some challenges in addressing those as well. And similarly, we need to adapt the rest of our local revegetation projects to really infuse with the climate-ready sort of approach as well. So that's kind of where we're heading, which kind of leaves the question for Upper Murrumbidgee catchment network, where are you heading with this and where might it fit? So it's interesting when you think about what's happening with climate change and how we respond to it, and how much do I actually need to do can be quite a hard question to answer. But what I've found is you'll see there's different estimates that are around in terms of how many trees we need to plant per person on the planet. And they tend to come in around 160 to 200, and that's to essentially stop or reverse climate change depending on whose numbers you want to use and where you want to read it from, but it's that sort of ballpark. So in the Canberra region, so this comes from the Canberra Joint Organisation area. It was a bit hard for me to draw the catchment thing in the Bureau of Stats data, I apologise, but I'm sure we can figure it out if you really want to. So there's about 300,000 people in the area, 298,853. So if we took on this challenge of planting 160 to 200,000 plants, you end up needing about 47 to 60 million mature trees in the ground, which sounds like a really big number, but when you think about it, that's only 160 to 200 per person. And if you narrowed that down to adults rather than kids, because getting kids planting trees is fun, but it's not always successful in terms of survival rate. But if we got adults to do that, even if half of them, if let's say all the adults did 500 to 1,000 trees each over 10 years, that's like 1 day a year, or if you don't want to work in such a hurry, 2 days a year. So it's a day or a weekend for every adult in the region over the next 10 years. That's actually not that hard. And so that's the sort of scale in the natural resource management space that we need to start thinking about, because with the way that climate change is going, it is giving this challenge of conservation and adaptation. And the only way that we're actually going to be able to manage all of this is to increase the amount of nature we've got and decrease the amount of resources that we use. But we need to wrap our heads around how much nature do we need, and it's an awful lot more. And so I want to leave you with that thought to help you think about how in all of your projects we can help head towards this sort of magnitude of scale. And I think what really reinforced to me why this is so important was on the trip I did in May. I ended up standing on the top of a mountain in the Wedden Mountains National Park, which is near Grenfell, only a couple of 100 kilometres away. and had this kind of bizarre experience. You stand on the top of the mountain, and if you look right, you're looking at the national park, and it's actually, a lot of it's secondary regrowth, but it's a dry sclerophyll forest. It's basically green, and you're looking over the tree canopy. And you look left, and it's all cleared cropland. And there is so few trees, and the ones that you can see are along the roadsides. So when I now think about what's humanity's impact on this planet, I imagine myself standing on the top of this mountain, because before colonisation, it was probably, because it was woodlands, pretty much like looking right on the mountain, and now it's completely different. Now, there's a whole range of reasons for that, and we're all part of it and whatever, and that's totally fine. But in terms of understanding the magnitude of what we need to do, it's getting a lot closer to this side in terms of the amount of nature we have in the world, and still being able to support humanity, which is what's going on in the cropping land. So we've got to bring these two things together. But that, for me, that was kind of the aha moment. I don't know why it took standing on a mountain to do it, but anyway, sometimes you have to do these things. So there's an idea of the scale. And I think the other thing is we need to hurry. Now this is the PSUH curve. Does somebody want to tell me what that stands for? So it's the pushing shit uphill curve. So here we are down at roughly 2020, 2021, right? A lot of the projections that I've been talking about today are based on a global warming of 1.5 degrees. We're actually heading at the moment, unless we change drastically what we do, towards more like somewhere between 2.5 and 5 is what this graph tells us. But we're down here, which means everything that we do right now is relatively easier, and it's got a lot higher chance of success if we do it between now and 2030 and 2040. If we try and plant 60 million trees down here, they're going to have a lot more trouble surviving than if we try and do it here. So we should do ourselves a favour and get on with it and do it now, because I can't imagine how hard it is down there, and we don't need to get there. If we do it here, we can actually make that difference. So if we get those 60 million trees in the ground and we reduce our resource consumption by about 80%, we don't have to go here. So I don't see the point in pushing shit uphill any further than it's got to go. So let's do it all here and actually take this big challenge and take that ramp up the scale, because if we just do it in little tiny increments, it'll actually be a lot harder and will take a lot longer. There's lots of variations on it with temperature and other things, but they all follow the same direction, and it all gets harder over time. So I think the main message today is that you're all doing really, really important work. We're all doing really, really important work. And our challenge now is to scale up and hurry up. So I hope that gives you some food for thought. And as I said, if you would like to talk some more about the Climate Ready Vegetation project or the local climate projections or anything in that space and what we've learned from what we've done here, then very happy to do that. I'm really conscious this is a once over lightly, but it also takes a while to get used to some of these ideas and get a grip to it personally and emotionally, as well as in a logical sort of sense. So that's about it from me.